Well, today I'm so excited. My guests are Trey and Matt Peeples. We're going to talk about a mission pathway, and looking forward to having this great conversation about what we're doing here in Iowa District West, but also what these guys are doing around the country as well within the LCMS. So good to have you guys on, Matt and Trey.
It's great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So let me kind of get the audience to get to know you. Give us a little bit about your ministry background. We'll start with you, Trey, and then we'll go to Matt. Just kind of tell us your journey into ministry.
Well, I grew up Presbyterian and then I met Matt, and Matt turned me into a diehard Lutheran, and so I was the worship arts coordinator at a church that Matt planted in Knoxville called The Point, and we worked together for about 5 years, and he discipled me and equipped me and sent me off to the seminary. And then after seminary, I ended up in the Houston area and got involved in church planting. And through that, Matt and I were trying to figure out how in the world can we make more disciple makers. And so we put this the missionary pathway together. And now I've taken a call at Joy Summerwood, and so kind of taken an existing congregation and working on moving them to a more missional stance and activities and stuff like that. So
cool. So Matt, tell us about your journey. I know a little bit about your story, but I'm sure there's parts of it that I've missed.
Yeah, I also didn't grow up Lutheran. I grew up Episcopal for a long time, did a lot of stuff with a Baptist youth group, and then we ended up Lutheran because my parents liked the preaching. And the day before I went to seminary, I found out my grandmother, my dad's mom, was actually Lutheran, but she moved to the South and they didn't have any Lutheran churches. So she went Methodist at the time. And so I found that out the day before I went to seminary. And when I was in seminary, I was like, okay, I think I definitely want to be a pastor. And then people were like, you should church plant. And I was like, no way. But, you know, it was kind of one of those cool things where it was an opportunity to really step out in faith and go beyond what I knew I could do. And I knew I would see God show up if we did that. And so church planting just all of a sudden, it rocked my world. I went down and trained in Hot Springs, Arkansas for planting, and then about 6 months, and then went and planted The Point. And we got to see lots of disconnected people connected to faith. You know, got connected with great people like Trey, who just had a love for Jesus, a love for the scriptures, and a passion for lost people. And I think when you have a love for Jesus and a love for the scriptures, Lutheran theology just makes sense. And so it wasn't like hey, why don't you become Lutheran and we'll give you a job? It was more of like, hey, you love lost people too. Let's do this. And the longer Trey was in it, the more he was like, yeah, this just makes sense. And so we turned.
Yeah, well, I found out that Lutheran doctrine is actually the best doctrine for evangelism out there. I tried the other ones, but Lutheran doctrine is the best.
Wow.
It really is. And that's really what drives the entire network. We started training church planters at The Point. And then about the time Trey went to seminary, a few months later, I actually took a call up to the Northeast. So I got to experience post-Christianity in its height, in the most post-Christian area of the country. And what I learned through that experience is, one, church planting's different up there. Like the cost of the quote unquote traditional church planting is just astronomical. But really what we're doing is we're leaving our greatest asset untapped. Like if we believe Lutheran theology is the greatest theology for reaching the lost, we should be training average everyday Christians how to share that where they're already going, because they're going to places and spaces you and I can't get into. And they already know a language that you and I would have to learn to be able to share that. But if we're equipping people to actually share their faith where they're already going, not only are we going to see people come to faith, and we're going to see the church and the Lutheran church by extension grow, but we're actually going to see new churches start in places you would never expect to see the church. And most people want to share their faith, but statistically, Lifeway did some great research, and they found out 7 out of 10 Christians have just not been trained in any method of sharing their faith whatsoever. So we'll look at them and say, hey, share your faith. And they're like, we would love to. How do we do that? And so enter the missionary pathway. It was a way to for Trey and I to raise up everyday Christians on mission, to train them the way you would train a church planter, but on a much simpler level, and basically make disciple makers who would, by extension, plant the church in the gospel.
It's funny you guys mentioned that, because when I was in the parish in Detroit and also in Milwaukee, that was a big passion of mine, because I wanted my people, because I always told them I could only trust people that my arms extend to. But if you guys put your arms out, there's so many more touch points that you guys can reach that I can never get into. And there's suspicion about me sharing the gospel, because people think outside the church that I'm paid to do this. You know,
Right?
you guys are doing it because you actually care about it.
Yeah, when I meet someone who's disconnected from Christ, for them to find out that I'm a pastor, that's the last thing I want them to find out, because it changes the conversation. They either run for the hills or they start speaking King James English. You know, oh brother, thou art. And so it's I just like to build relationships with them first, and then they're like, oh wait, you're a pastor? Whoa, okay. But I think that the everyday average ordinary believer actually has an advantage when it comes to discipling and evangelism that pastors don't have.
Well,
So before we get deeper, go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, statistically, we share this a lot, but the reality is, and you learn this in the post-Christian world, but it's happening more and more, like when you read the book, The Great Dechurching, but like people just aren't showing up to the local church anymore. In fact, even Christians aren't showing up to the local church anymore. And that's obviously another topic for another time. But, the interesting thing is, we think that correlates to people not being interested in Jesus. But Barna did some amazing research where they found out from Gen Z all the way up to boomers, there is a really high curiosity and desire to connect with God and grow spiritually. And so the issue is, we just need to figure out how to leave the church and share that where people are going, instead of saying, if you darken the doors of my church, then I'll share Jesus with you. But till then, I'm just going to keep it as a really great secret.
And that's a good point. I just did a series on those who left the church and asked the question, what led to you leaving the church? And for those who came back, it was an interesting analogy or observation. One was, a lot of times they went to church seeking, like you talked about, relationships. They came seeking authentic Christians who could share their journey with them, because they were struggling in the world. And when they saw Christians who said, well, I never had those problems growing up. I'm like, and I go back and I kind of unpack for Christians, you never grew up in a time where gas was really high, where inflation was really bad, where the society seemed like it was morally falling apart. You didn't have any of those experiences that you can share. Yeah, we did have that, but guess what? We knew that God was there. And when you break it down and start thinking about it, so, you think about the Carter administration, and it was some of the same things we're having now, some of the same problems, some of the same tension, some of the same unrest in the world. Can you relate that to someone who's also seeking answers in this world, because they look for authentic Christians who actually have struggled, but somehow came out the other side, and tell them how that happened for you and where you found strength? That's what they're really looking for. And they don't find that, they go, well, this is not the place for me because everybody here is perfect.
Yeah. Or they're not dealing with the issues I'm dealing with, you know?
It just cracks me up. Before we dive in too far, I think we should kind of define a term that I think we're going to talk about a lot in this podcast, but it's one term that I think the church really struggles to wrap their mind around. Can you guys tell me how you have come up with the definition of discipleship?
Yeah.
So I think before we define discipleship, we have to define what a disciple is. And I like to go to when Jesus called the first disciples. He saw Peter and John out fishing, and and they had a miraculous catch. But he said, "Follow me, and I will make you to become fishers of people." And I think, it doesn't say everything that that there is to be said about what a disciple is, but it gives us a good framework. And I think there's three parts of a disciple. First, a disciple is someone who follows Jesus. Jesus said, "Follow me."
Mhm.
So Jesus leads, we follow. The second is a disciple is someone who's being changed or transformed by Jesus. He said, "I will make you become." He didn't say you will make you become. He said, "I will make you become."
Mhm.
So there's a transformation, a change that happens as we start to follow Jesus, where we become more like Jesus. And then what's he going to make us become? Well, he was talking to fishermen, so we put it in fisherman language. He said, fishers of people. But that means that we're going to be on mission with Jesus.
Mhm.
So, a disciple is someone who follows Jesus, is being changed by Jesus, and who's on mission with Jesus to do what? Make more disciples. And
And
so, go ahead.
thing we have to understand too is discipleship is not a uniquely Christian thing, because at the very heart, a disciple is a follower of something or someone. And so Jesus really called us to follow him, to be disciples of him. And so I think that's a really important thing to understand, because people already baseline understand that concept, even if they don't think they understand the concept. Like, we all follow a certain thought, we all follow a leader of some kind, whether we're aware of it or we're not. What Jesus is calling us to do is to make him the one that we follow, to follow him, and then to help others follow him as we're following him. And
Right.
I think that's important in the church, because you'll hear this question, and I think it's a bad question. And, the right answer to the wrong question is still the wrong answer. And it's this: are you making disciples? The reality is you are making disciples. The better question is, who are you making disciples of?
Mm.
Are you making disciples of Jesus, or are you making disciples of you, disciples of a certain style or format that you like your political party? No, who are you making disciples of? And our call is to make disciples of Jesus.
And and kind of what drives me personally is to be intentional about it.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I've found to be so true is that discipleship is more than just knowing the right answers to the questions. It's more than just what you know. It's really who you know, Jesus, and helping people to walk along, walking alongside someone and following Jesus. And so there's some action steps in
Mhm.
discipleship as well. And it's not, and we don't do these things to earn God's grace. We do it
Yeah.
because we've got it. It's so
Mhm.
discipleship is well, I think discipleship can start before conversion. I think people are discipled into faith, but then once someone is in faith, they're asking the question, so what now? and
Right.
and so that relationship with another believer, to walk alongside them,
Mhm.
in that sanctification process of becoming more like Jesus, it's just crucial. I mean, when I look
Yeah.
back at my journey, uh I've been in church for a long time, but the things that made the most impact in a discipleship, in within that discipleship frame, was uh personal relationships. It was, sitting around a campfire with a beer with my Christian buddies and talking about life and faith and how it all comes together.
Mhm.
It was, getting to work with Matt, where, we had a lot of time where it was just he and I,
Yeah.
in the office working on stuff. And
Yeah.
as we were serving the church, Matt was pouring into me. And so, it's discipleship really has to happen in relationship, and the most powerful discipleship happens, very personally.
Yeah, all evangelism is discipleship. Not all discipleship is evangelism. And I think understanding that is really helpful too, because that same process you would use to help somebody grow in their faith is a process you use to help somebody come to faith. It's conversation, it's relationship, it's intentionality. It's one of those areas I'm not a language scholar, so I have no business saying this. But what I will say is one text where we should really retranslate is the Great Commission. And we should not have it say go. We should have it say the real sense of as you are going. And the reason for that is
Absolutely.
because if you say go, words create worlds. And so the average person is thinking, okay, I've got to go somewhere else. I've got to do something else. I've got to add something new to my schedule that's not already there. Versus Jesus said, as you are going, meaning God's probably already got intentionality with where you work, with where you live, with the people you hang out with. And so discipleship is about being intentional about making disciples in those places you're already going. So it's not about adding more to your schedule. It's about being more intentional with the schedule God's given you.
Yeah, because the command there is not go. The command is make disciples.
Yeah.
Right. As you guys were talking, something struck me. We talk about discipleship and discipling people to be like Jesus. That means that we're teaching people to have a heart like Jesus, one of compassion for our neighbor, to have hands like Jesus, who, when he saw a need, Jesus met a need, to have feet like Jesus, that as we go about our daily work, we're looking for opportunities to bring. As one of my podcast guests, I love this term. It's my favorite term of the year is to sparkle Jesus wherever we go. So the idea that as Christians, we're going out with that love of Jesus, the heart of Jesus, the hands of Jesus, and we're sparkling his love and his compassion and his grace as we go about our daily lives. And to me, that's what we're teaching our people to do. We're not teaching them to go preach the gospel unless they're called to do that. We're teaching them to reflect and live a life that models the Jesus that we love and serve.
Yeah, I call them positive Christian bumps.
Yeah.
And that's my evangelism strategy, because that's what worked on me. I was far from God. I was running from him, didn't want to have anything to do with God or the church. And honestly, it was everyday, average, ordinary disciples who loved on me. And it wasn't just one. It wasn't one conversation. It wasn't one person. It was a series from multiple people who showed me that Jesus loves me by the way that they interacted with me and treated me with honor, dignity, and respect. And they, as you said, they sparkled Jesus. They were a good reflection of Jesus into my life. And the Holy Spirit used all of those different interactions to work faith in my heart.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for us to remember, and I think one of the things that gets confused is we forget the things that people are specifically called to and the things we're all called to. So some people are specifically called into full-time vocational ministry, and that's a specific calling, but all people are called to the mission of Jesus. Some people are called to preach. All people are called to share the gospel. That's why we're called to be a light, a city on a hill. That's why Jesus said, go and make disciples. He expected everybody to do that. And I think sometimes we can be so overprotective about the specific call that some people have that we lose sight of what all people have been called to do. And by extension, what we that have a very specific call are supposed to be equipping them to do, if that makes sense.
I mean, that's Ephesians 4 ministry. I mean, the scripture is very clear that that those of us who are called into vocational ministry, our job is to equip the saints for the work of ministry. So we're kind of like the lead equippers. And imagine what we could do if we equipped people in order to equip people.
Yeah.
What if the equipping, facilitated more equipping? I mean, that's how the church worked for, from the beginning. I mean, you just look at Acts 2.
Yeah, right. And when we do that, we're in line with Scripture, because the reality is we forget that when you read Scripture, the missionaries are always the one that already have the gospel, and they're sent out to people that don't have the gospel. The problem is our 20th century, it's really a 20th century strategy for evangelizing, is creating the lost person as the missionary. So the lost person's the one that's expected to walk through our doors at church. The lost person's the one that's expected to learn the language, the culture, and the context of church in order to hear the gospel. And the reality is it's our job to go out into the community, to learn the language, to learn the context, to be able to share the gospel. So really the question is, who is the missionary? And are we equipping our people to be the missionaries, or are we asking them to invite lost people to be the missionary in our church?
And then the other part of the problem is we want the newly converted person to go get their lost friend to bring them to do the same thing again. You know,
Yeah.
that's
And
the other part of the play.
We also want them to act like they were in church their whole life.
Right.
You know? So like, I'll never forget when we first planted the point and our attendance was like this big roller coaster, right? And I remember looking at my wife getting so frustrated with that. And she looks at me and she goes, "Why do you expect somebody who's brand new to the faith to act like they've been there for 20 years? And I was like, oh, yeah, that makes sense.
I love that. So let's dive into your Kairos network, because I want to have some time to talk about that as well. So can you tell me what led to the inception of the Kairos network and the vision behind the mission pathway?
Yeah, so the Kairos network started really organically. It started because I never felt like I was ready to plant a church. And then I got a chance to be trained in church planting. And it changed what I was able to do when I went out and planted. And it also kind of spurred in me that heart to want other people to be trained to do that. So it started as just church plant training, and it started in Tennessee through our church plant. And then I was called up to New Jersey to take over an existing church, do some revitalization, and to launch out church plant training through the district. And so that's kind of where the Kairos name was born, was doing it up there. And as I was doing it up there, and we launched out a few churches in New Jersey, which was really fun to see that happen. What I realized was, man, we really need to be better at training average everyday Christians. I also learned from revitalizing a church how much time, effort, and energy is spent doing that, and how much more fruitful it can be to just start something new. And that we don't always have to have a high cost on starting something new. I started getting exposed to this idea of what it could look like to launch out average everyday Christians and equip them more to do ministry and to launch things out where they're already going. And how, when you're living in an area like a New Jersey, you know, essentially in the metro New York area, you know, where the cost of living is insanely high, where it's an incredibly post-Christian culture, like the old strategies of like getting a plot of land and putting up a building and putting a pastor in place just aren't going to, they're not going to plant a church, and they're going to be insanely expensive to do it. Versus, you know, we're always, essentially what we're always doing, Keith, is we're always trying to take people who are trained for ministry and send them to a location and get them to fall in love with the location, versus taking the people that already love that place, that already have family there, rhythms there, an understanding of the culture, and training them for ministry. And so really what the missionary pathway was Trey and I saying, Trey was trying to do that in Houston. I was trying to do that in New Jersey and beyond. And I was like, we were like, hey, if we're going to develop this, let's do this together. Because we have that same mission heart and we love working together. And so when we launched that out, what we realized was, one, we set out to do that everyday missionary training so that somebody could launch ministry where they're already going, you know, learn how to make a disciple where they're going, learn how to launch ministry there. What we also accidentally did was we accidentally solved one of the biggest problems in church planting, which is usually there's a church planter that's trained in contextualization and sharing the gospel and learning a community and creating word sacrament ministry for that place. And there's a whole group of people trying to come along that only know how to think past church experience. And so now, thanks to training like the missionary pathway, you're able to have that trained key point person that helps plant something, but you also have a whole team of people that also know how to contextualize the gospel, that also know how to make a disciple, and that are also thinking in that vein. And so through doing that, it essentially allowed us to expand the pool of people that could plant ministry and to create different cost models and structure for planting ministry. Because when you're planting a ministry with average everyday people, you no longer have to have $200,000 or $300,000 in the bank to do it. You can start with $0 and somebody's passion and where they're already going. And you can essentially plant more things and see what really starts to grow and mature.
You talk about church planting. You know, I being in a district position, every time I mention church planting, I always have people who say, why plant new churches? We already have existing ones. Just fix those. Don't go and plant new things. So
here's
for
why.
those, yeah.
Here's why. So, I didn't make this up. I got this from Pastor Joe Sullivan at New Beginnings in Pacific, Missouri, but he said different churches reach different people. More churches reach more people, and new churches reach new people. And so, and it's true. I mean, if you look at the data backs it up. New churches, they reach new people. More churches reach more people. Different churches reach different people. If you look at the percentage of people who are disconnected from the church in any community, we cannot plant enough churches fast enough to reach that many people. I mean, it's you don't have to worry about losing people. There's plenty of lost people that are already lost out there, and so why not create more Christ-centered communities that look a little bit different from one another, that reach people that are wired a little bit different. It just, I mean, to me, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah. Also, from a practical standpoint, too, like going along with that, there's a few things to understand about revitalization. One, if churches plant churches, those churches that plant things become more missional and more vibrant. The other thing is revitalization as a concept, it has a really low success rate. Like roughly 10% of churches could radically revitalize. Generally, what will happen in a revitalization is, think about it like a bungee cord. Churches have a general DNA, they have a general like ethos to them. And so you can stretch that bungee cord. And when you're putting pressure on it, it will move to a certain point. But the second you release that pressure, it will tend to go back to its natural size and shape. So you're also going to spend a lot of money trying to revitalize something, even though there's resources there, and those resources can tend to be blinding for people. They're like, but there's already resources here. But when you're planting something new, you can do far more with far less, if that makes sense. The other thing is,
go ahead.
Well, oftentimes in revitalization, the last thing I'll say to that is, oftentimes you're taking an existing group of people that are being discipled in that place, that are growing to know and love Jesus, and you're essentially trying to change the entire structure. So you're essentially saying, we're going to change reaching this one group to reach this other one group. Instead of saying, okay, this group's being served and some of them are going to move into some new stuff, but how can we serve this group and still reach out to those other groups? And I would say that's where you find the benefit of planting, and planting through local churches cohorting together. Now you've got the chance to start ministry without losing the ministry that's serving Grandma Schmidt, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and I do think that planting in teams of congregations, networks of congregations, is the healthiest and most successful. I've been blessed to be a part of a network in the Houston area. Well, it's actually bigger than the Houston area now. It just started with a couple of congregations in Houston. It's called the Harvest Partnership. A couple of congregations said, we can do this, and so they pooled their resources together, called out a church planter, and sent some resources and some people, and then and now, then they called another planter and did the same thing, and then they called me, and now you get on a Harvest Partnership Zoom call, and it's a full screen, and there's no territorialism, or we just partner together, and the thing that gets asked is, what do you need? And chances are that somebody else sitting at that table is going to have what you need. And we just we share resources. We call them the 5 capitals, and not only that, but the community and camaraderie that we have, and just the relational support that we have as pastors and church workers. It's like what circuits are supposed to be. It's really healthy, and we actually genuinely enjoy each other's company. But man, there are so many different mission starts that are happening out of it, that working together, it mitigates the risk. So it's not like one congregation has to fit the whole bill. Some congregations, they have financial capital. Others have relational capital, or they have people, or they have space. And when you put it all together, the Lord uses it and does amazing stuff with it. So I really recommend networking when it comes to church planting.
That's
And
so
I
cool.
think people,
I've always wanted to church plant, but I always ended up at established congregations that were what I call transitional heavy lifts. And what I discovered was leading existing congregations was like trying to steer the Titanic. It took us so long to avoid the iceberg. Whereas the mission church was like a speedboat, and they could more easily navigate because they didn't have as many structures and as many rules and regulations that have been established over time. And I also discovered with new church plants that someone used an example of a Lego. Lego has maybe 9 pegs in it or 6 pegs in it. If you're an established church and you're a 6-peg Lego, all of your pegs are completely full with relationships. When you go to a new church plant, they may only have 4 pegs that are full. So there is space for new people in newer churches versus old established churches. So when new people come in, they're more likely to find people that are unconnected, but a part of that church than they would in an established church.
Well, and with an established church, one of the best ways to revitalize is to plant. Or participate in it, especially with a network, because now you're looking outward and you're having a baby. And just think about, in human relationships, when a couple has a child, all of a sudden all their priorities change. What used to be about us is now all about that baby. And and in congregations that I've been a part of that have planted, or in that I've also interacted with, the people at those congregations start saying, "Wait, if they can do it, we can do it too." You find that they start getting more missional, and when you do that, it's really, really important to, instead of having a losing mentality, like we just lost people to this church plant, to have a sending mentality. We are sending them, because you celebrate the sending. You mourn the losing. But planting and participating in a mission like that, it really does help the church that needs to, that kickstart again. When Matt and I were out at the Point, there were a ton of people that would go to the early service at our sending congregation at Grace, and then they would come over to check on their child and come over to the Point. And so they were kind of like dual citizens,
Right.
and it was just a really neat and awesome, healthy relationship.
Yeah, and I think that's, what it does, 2 things. One, it creates a better kingdom mentality. I think it's sad when we live in a world where Starbucks has a better kingdom mentality than the local church. Like, Starbucks does not care if I go to the Starbucks down the street, because they know at the end of the day, all that money's going to Starbucks and it's supporting Starbucks. We in the local church get mad, even though we should have a kingdom theology, especially as Lutherans, right? We believe in the visible and the invisible church, and there's one invisible church that Jesus is the head over. So if we're planting 3 or 4 churches and a few people go to a different church, well, hey, that's okay, because they're still in the kingdom of God. And if we really believe in our word sacrament theology, that it really is the best theology, then if it's the best, we should be doing everything we can to get it out there, versus allowing, things that we would feel are not as high a caliber a theology from human standpoints to be the ones that are the best at planting. Like, if we have the best theology, we should be the best at planting. The other thing is, it creates a really intentional modalic and sodalic relationship. So modalic organizations, like established churches, they tend to be bigger. They tend to have more resources, more established. And so they've got benefits to that. But like Keith, like you were saying, trying to turn something like that doesn't spin on a dime. It's like turning the Titanic. versus a sodalic organization is smaller. It tends to have less resources, but it's able to experiment more, to test the missional edges. And when you see those things not as competitive, but as complementary to each other, you see incredible things happen. And when there's an intentional relationship between a modalic and a sodalic organization, what you find is all of the experimenting and all of the learnings from that sodalic organization can help, really curve the learning curve of the modalic organization. So all of a sudden you have a much higher learning agility than you had if you were on your own as a modalic organization. On the flip side, as a sodalic organization, being connected with a modalic organization keeps you from testing the missional edges to a point where you literally fall off the cliff. It also creates better resourcing than what you would have on your own. You even see this in the corporate world. Like in the corporate world, if a company wants to do something and try something, they will oftentimes create a skunkworks company. It's a separate entity and organization that allows them to do things differently in a way that allows them to experiment, test, and really try something in a way that doesn't break the existing modalic, but it allows them to benefit from those learnings and support back and forth.
Yeah, and I love what you said about the kingdom mentality. Um, there's a difference between a kingdom mentality and a castle mentality. And once again, words create worlds. And I think that the way that we've used the word church has created a world that is not what Christ intended for his church. Because we call it, so, I'm at Joy Lutheran Church. You're at this Lutheran church. Somebody's at that Lutheran church. You've got your church, my church, this church, that church. But we're really congregations. There's only one church, and it's Christ Church. And we are just different expressions of it, different parts of the body. But because we have used the word church in that way, we have separated and become these little castles instead of being full participants in the kingdom.
I love that. Let's get into some specifics of the mission pathway training. So what are your core principles that you would say?
Yeah, core principles are solidly Lutheran theology. One, we're Christ-centered, gospel-centered, centered in word and sacrament understanding, centered in a Lutheran framework for reading the scriptures. And then also, it's very much an understanding of a training that's less focused on here are the nuts and bolts of how you do something, and first and foremost focuses people on their connection with Jesus. So when you do the missionary pathway, you'll open with a session where we talk about our operating system of church, meaning what's our understanding of how mission in the church works? Because for most people, that's not something they're aware of, and they're making decisions and they're trying to do mission, not understanding what's driving that under the surface. And so we'll help them understand that. But then after that, we move into sessions where we dig into prayer and fasting, where we dig into 2 sessions on the gospel. One, where we just get people experiencing the gospel, because to be honest, oftentimes as Lutherans, we're taught to share the gospel, but we forget that we're supposed to experience that as well. So like we look at what the gospel is, it's simple, but it's not simplistic. And then we move into contextualizing the gospel. What aspects of the gospel do we lead with? We forget also that the gospel has more than just the forensic model of justification, right? The gospel is so much bigger than that. And different communities need to lead, you need to lead with different aspects of the gospel. So we cover all of that in the first 5 sessions before we even hit engaging and starting to do some of those practical missional things. And when we start there, we really start with listening to the community, because what we found is if you start with engaging, most people won't listen. And the thing the church needs to do first is to listen to the community around them, listen to people around them. Because if you will listen to people in the community, they will literally tell you how to reach them. They'll give you the language, they'll give you the playbook. I mean, it becomes so simple that it almost feels like you're cheating, But it just comes from like listening. And then from listening, we then teach people how to engage the community in really practical, healthy ways. We'll teach people how to have spiritual conversations, when to have spiritual conversations, because sometimes it's not the right time. And then from there, we'll move into basic understanding of how to make a disciple and how to do discipleship in the community where you're already going. And then we'll move into where discipleship can go. Ministries launching out, new churches launching out, things like that.
I love that. And I love the idea of contextualizing the gospel for the community. I try to get churches to understand that. Like if I did a sermon one time in Burr Ridge, Illinois, which is one of the wealthiest suburbs of Chicago. And I did the same sermon the same afternoon at Rockford Lutheran, in Rockford, which was one of the poorer communities. In the morning, it was the same sermon. It was a story about the unjust judge. The morning sermon message was mostly about persistence in prayer, because they understood that. That afternoon, it was about, what it's like to face what you seems to you like injustice in your life, but you have a God who's just, who understands your situation. So they could relate in Rockford with the widow who was coming before the judge, feeling like she wasn't getting justice, whereas the people in Burr Ridge probably didn't feel that way. But they could understand, being persistent in my prayers, especially if you're pretty well. You may go, I don't need God as much today, because things are going pretty well. But it was the same text, but it was contextualized for the people who need to hear it.
Yeah, and I love that, because both of those readings of the text, both of those preachings of the text are accurate, and they're on point. And you just had to lead with a different part. And I think sometimes when you talk about leading with different aspects of the gospel, people get a little hesitant. They're like, wait, what do you what do you mean? But so in that section, actually what we did is we actually took different Lutheran ministries from around the country, and we showed how they were leading with different aspects of the gospel and why. And that really helps people kind of open their eyes to, oh, this is what that looks like. And this is what it means to be Lutheran. I think we have the greatest gift in Lutheran theology ever that we don't choose to lean into. And that's that our confessions say that worship is boiled down to word and sacrament. That is the most contextualizable bucket you could possibly have. There's no dictated specific worship style. There's no dictated specific language that we have to preach the gospel in. There's no specific liturgical format that it has to happen in. It's word and sacrament. And we use those historic things that we've always used in the church because they're great anchors. Like the creed keeps us anchored to historic Christianity. The Lord's Prayer is the prayer Jesus taught us to pray. So we definitely want to be using that. And the sacraments, baptism, communion, that allows us to experience, those gifts of grace that God has to give in a really tangible way that people need. But, the rest of it, let's be contextual. And you will find in church planting, I learned this when I was doing church plant training in City to City in Manhattan, the hardest place for people to contextualize is worship. They will tend to do something they like or something they are reacting against, instead of actually stepping into community and saying, what language do people speak? What music do they listen to? What time is best for worship in this community? Because as Dan Fanco found out, who does Camino de Fe in New Jersey, a Hispanic ministry, Sunday morning at 9:00 is not the best time if you want to reach that community. But because he has freedom to contextualize, he's able to do it at a time that actually allows him to reach that community, versus being so rigid in his format that he can't reach the people he really desires to reach.
I'm pretty sure, though, that in the first set of the tablets that Moses brought down, 9 a.m. was one of the commandments. So I'm. I'm curious too. How do you guys adapt what you're doing in Mission Pathway to the challenges of sharing our faith in this fast and ever-paced changing world? Because it's just, things are constantly evolving and moving, and language is shifting. So how do you help address that challenge with Mission Pathway?
Well, that's where listening to your community really makes a difference. And we say, listen. Listen more than you talk. Listen to learn, not to respond, and listen to show people that you care. And as you're listening, you go through a process, kind of like Paul did at the Areopagus, where you look at this culture and you say, what's good in this culture? What's bad in this culture? and what's redeemable. And when you take the time to kind of assess that, because Paul used the Greek poets, as his proof text for there being one God, and so when you do that, it helps you to speak in the language that people can hear, because communication takes both a transmitter and a receiver. And if the transmitter and the receiver are on different frequencies, they're not going to communicate with each other. You're not going to pick up 89.3 when you're dialed into 100.5 on the FM station. It's not going to work. I mean, 89.3 is still transmitting, but you're not going to receive it. And so it's figuring out how to get on the same frequency.
And that's the thing. When Trey and I built this, we built it on why principles, or first article principles. So we essentially did the heavy lifting of that in the development. And what we did is we said, we are going to make this the most basic cellular level possible. And if something's done in why principles, what you're saying is, this is true to first article creation. This is just how people are created. This is true in how communities operate, relationships operate, and the basic mandates that Jesus gave, right? And so we took that and we created the pathway built on that, so that basically you're learning the tools and you become the contextual expert. And what we've learned is, I've used this with all groups of lay people, all groups of pastors. I've used it with pastors that lead really small churches that are on a shoestring budget. I've led it with planters, and I've led it with pastors that have big staffs, and I've led their entire staff through it. And what I found is, I've never had to change the pathway. The pathway has made an impact in everybody, and everybody's immediately been able to contextualize it to their context and able to think through how to make disciples. I think one of the things the pathway does is, oftentimes what happens in the disciple making space, as far as training people in disciple making, you'll see one of two things happen. You'll see either somebody say, we're going to completely customize this. So people spend a year plus on a whiteboard trying to figure out how to make disciples without actually making disciples. Or they're given a very rigid system that has no flexibility, and they're told, this is the only way you can make disciples, use this. And so what Missionary Pathway, the heart behind it is, essentially it teaches people how to make disciples by making disciples. It breaks it down to the most simple process possible, because simple is highly reproducible. The average layperson could put this into practice, or the average pastor could put it into practice. And that's why it's starting to expand so much, is because it's a really simple thing. And so our thing is, we hope this is something that helps you crawl, walk, and run into discipleship. So we help you crawl, you start to walk, and then eventually somebody may take the missionary pathway and totally throw it to the side and do their own thing. And we would celebrate that. We would celebrate other people that have other processes they use to make disciples, because Trey and I kind of just killed our egos a long time ago. And we just kind of believe that Jesus told us to make disciples, and not that only Trey and Matt can make disciples. And so that's kind of how we dealt with it. But the interesting thing is, when you make things really simple like that, where the average person could leave that and start implementing it immediately, what you find is it creates a flywheel effect. And so when we started Missionary Pathway, there were 18 people in 2 cohorts, and that was September 2022. By December of 23, there were 350 people that had signed up in 8 countries. By January 24, there were 450 in 12 countries. And by February of 24, there were almost 550. And it expands like that because all of a sudden people that went through it, they'll just randomly email us or call us and be like, hey, we started a cohort. I'm like, awesome. They're like, what do we need to do? I was like, nothing. And I give a lot of that credit to Trey, because when we were developing this, I had just left my call and I was making $0. And so when we were developing this thing, I was like, hey, then maybe we could sell this and maybe I would not be making $0 anymore. And as we were developing it, Trey goes, we should really make sure this thing's free so that we don't create a lid on discipleship. And I was like, shoot, Trey, you're right. We should. So like as a network, we're able to exist because we have awesome partnerships like the Iowa West, and we only charge people when we get involved. So if we're going to train cohorts of leaders or we're going to help develop strategy, then we'll charge. But the actual platform, we want people to walk through that and redeploy it. And I want the church that's got 20 people that's barely hanging on to not have a lid on discipleship. And I want the church that's got 1,000 in worship to not be thinking, okay, well, if we take 100 of our leaders through this, how much is this going to cost? And how much do we have to budget for it? It's going to cost you your time. That's what it's going to take. And that was Trey and I's commitment from the beginning.
So talk about the importance or the role that trainers play in the cohorts.
Yeah. Trey?
Yeah, really, they're facilitators. They just help to bring out what the Holy Spirit's already working in you. You know, we set it up with a what's called a transformational learning style. It's 10, 20, 70. So 10% is book learning. You know, it's knowledge based, and that's all on the platform. And you do that before you get into your cohort in your meeting. And then the next 20% is meeting with with a group of people and with a trainer, a facilitator, and you're processing that what you've learned, and you're contextualizing it, and you're wrestling with it, and on top of that, it models what making disciples looks like, because it really is. It's based on relational discipleship. If you take the process of the missionary pathway, and instead of it being, going through the missionary pathway stuff, and you put the Bible in there, you can make disciples all day long. I mean, that's what it's designed for. And then the other 70% is actually doing it. Because one of the things that I got tired of is, I can't tell you how many times I've been involved in, okay, we're going to do a 10-week intensive book study on reading the book, How to Make Disciples. And, you get a group of people together and you go through the book, How to Make Disciples. And at the end of the 10 weeks, you're like patting yourself on the back. Great job, everybody. We got through that book. What's the next book study? And you never get around to actually making a disciple. And what the missionary pathway is designed to do is get you actually doing it while you're learning it, and it builds on itself. And what the facilitators and trainers do is they kind of keep you accountable to doing that.
Yeah, so they create the space, because in a transformational learning style too, it's not like the academic style where it's like you went through that competency, take a test, you got a B, you got a C, you got an A, whatever, that's your grade, you move on. In core competency style, you move on when you feel like you have a competent understanding. And so the facilitator also helps create that pace. They're also somebody that's experienced it. So whether it's they've been through it and they're starting to live that out, or they've spent a lifetime doing this, they bring a certain level of experience. And so that experience brings their stories, the experience they have from other stories. And then also those facilitators are the ones that are modeling what discipleship looks like. So like Trey's saying, that 20% time is so important, because in that's actually where somebody's experiencing what it could look like to be discipled. And so those trainers have experienced that. And then also we take another layer. Anytime somebody goes through the pathway, we give them the opportunity to become a certified trainer. So we send them some more course, some more resources, and then we do a monthly meetup with any trainer that wants to jump on, anybody that's training people through. And we just collaboratively discuss together different topics, like what people are seeing. We'll dig into things like, how do you ask good questions? How do you launch groups? We'll let the trainers learn from each other. And so we've also got a system in place where people that are facilitating are also continuing to be equipped. And that models for people what I like to call the chain of discipleship, which is sometimes we're afraid to disciple because we're like, well, what if I don't know something? Well, in a discipling relationship, it becomes very organic because you're in relationship with somebody you're discipling. You're probably also in relationship with somebody who's been discipling you. And so when you come up against those questions you don't know, you pick up the phone and you call that person you're in relationship with. And now you've got another person there that's helping you discern the Spirit and what it is, historic Christianity has said and how you can navigate that. And I think that's huge. And sometimes that scares Lutherans, right? We're like, but we need more command and control, right? I think what we need to do is just remember that most heresy historically has come from the top down and not the bottom up. And we need to trust our people a little bit more, and we need to trust the Holy Spirit a little bit more, that he's actually been running this church for a long time. He's always used average, everyday Christians to do it, and he'll take care of it.
I love that. As we this is exciting to hear about this, but people listening are probably going to go, this is really nice, but can you give me some testimonies of some effective mission pathway success stories that I can say, yeah, this sounds really great on paper. I've seen this movie before, but is it really working?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
We got a bunch. Trey, you give one.
Yeah. Well, honestly, just last week we were on a Zoom call with a bunch of church planters, and we had a vicar on the call, and he's wrapping up his vicarage, and he's about to go back to the seminary. And for his evangelist project, what he did was he took the missionary pathway into an existing congregation of 600 members. And he said that over the year, it's amazing that having that in there has revitalized the congregation. They're on mission. And he told a story about an everyday, average, ordinary believer, I don't even know his name, who had gone through the missionary pathway, went on a cruise, ended up in a conversation with someone at the bar. And the person that he was talking to got connected to Christ. He's helping them find a congregation where they live. And his friend was sitting next to him, who is also disconnected from the church. He watched the whole thing happen and said, man, can you get me connected? My wife and I, we need to get connected to this. So it also started an ongoing discipling relationship there. And he went back to this vicar and said, man, if I hadn't have gone through the missionary pathway, I would not have known how to have those spiritual conversations. And, and that was, he just kind of threw that out at us. And I was in tears just thinking about, it was just like, just so amazing how, someone went through a missionary pathway, learned was equipped to have spiritual conversations, because as the conversation started, she was talking about getting into a car wreck. She totaled her car, busted her arm. And she said, how could, if there's a God, how could he let something like that happen? And he heard the word God, and he was like, okay, it's time to have a spiritual conversation. And so he just reached into his toolkit and was able to have one.
Wow.
One of the ones I'm thinking of is, we've got some great stories of ministry leaders. It's the average everyday Christians that are blowing me away. So we have a lady at one of the churches I'm serving at here, Karen, and she wanted to do missionary pathway. She was a little bit hesitant when she was going to step in, but she's like, I'm going to try this. But the missionary pathway we were doing with all the lay people here, that time slot didn't work out. So I said, well, hey, just jump on one of our other cohorts that we have on Zoom going around the country. She ends up in a cohort with all pastors and a district president. And she's like, should I be in this cohort? I was like, yes, you need to be in this cohort. She starts serving at a ministry, kind of like a halfway house ministry, baking cookies and like decorating cookies. And she brings the cookies. She starts using her cookie decorating business to build relationships with these people in this transitional housing, coming out of recovery, like building these deep relationships, sharing the story, catching fire. Now she's leading 2 new cohorts that are launching out within our church. And she is looking for places she can share faith. And it's like, to see her story just would blow you away. And it's the kind of thing where it just took time, and it didn't matter that she couldn't step in with other lay people. She jumped right in with those pastors and that district president. And like, it was so cool because everybody was learning together, and they were inspired by her story and what they saw going. And she was inspired by how they were wrestling with these things, because oftentimes we think the pastor and especially the district president's got everything figured out,
Right.
It's like, so I think that's the power of the pathway is it gives you a really simple process that all you have to do is create time and space for the relationship and create the space to make discipleship happen, which takes about 4 months to walk through the pathway well, because you don't want to rush through it. You don't want to see 8 sessions and be like, this is 8 weeks. Trey and I tried that when we first launched it out, and we realized it was way too fast for the pastors in the group. And what I've learned is, and I learned this from Mac Lake, you can't microwave discipleship development. Like, you need a little bit of that crock pot time. And so the big thing we've learned from these stories is slow down, and less is more. So like, we would have cohorts of just a few people, and in the American understanding, it's like, well, is it really going to be worth it spending 4 months with 3 people? Yeah, it is.
Mhm.
Because those 3 people start getting out and making disciples, and some of them start launching cohorts, and now you've got 4 and 5 cohorts launching out because you spent time with 3 people. And so that's been kind of the cool part of the process. It's just, most of the things we hear, we've got in Iowa West, we've got a guy that was running men's small groups who is now caught fire. He's running several of these, not just in his church, but in his neighborhood. We have pastors that are now opening board meetings with Discovery Bible Study. So even the church board meeting is turning into a time of discipleship. And one cool story, Keith, is we had one of our first pastors that went through the cohort was a pastor in Vancouver. And he started doing Discovery Bible Study with his board. Well, in that board meeting, his president's learning how to do Discovery Bible Study when he was just showing up for a church management meeting. So the president's brother calls him from across the country in Canada, and he's going through some really hard times in his life. And the president goes, hey, I just learned to do this new Discovery Bible Study thing. Would you want to just start reading the Bible together? And the guy's like, yeah. So he would wake up at 5 a.m. He's on the west coast of Canada. His brother's on the east coast. He'd wake up at 5 a.m. They would do a Discovery Bible Study together. And all of a sudden, his brother's life from across the country is changing because a pastor was willing to take a little bit of time for discipleship at the beginning of a board meeting. And like, those are the kind of stories that just still like blow me away.
Wow, that's cool. So I'm curious, as you guys are doing this, how do you see the mission pathway evolving in the future to further expand its reach and impact?
Yeah, it's been very organic. So really, I see the way it's expanding is by us giving more and more permission to people that have been through it.
Mhm.
They're really taking it to the next level and to a place that Trey and I couldn't even have imagined. We still lead people through cohorts, but now we also spend a lot of time pouring into people that are pouring into other people. So I kind of get the opportunity to do both, which is really fun. And spending time helping trainers learn how to train, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So this is my favorite question to kind of wrap up our conversation. This is for each of you individually. So Matt, what do you want your legacy to be?
I want my legacy to be living a life that people who were disconnected from Jesus saw my life and they got connected to him and they became a reflection of who he is and saw more people impacted from it. That's my goal for my family, my career, everything I do.
Same question, Trey.
That more disciples would be made who make disciples. And when by definition for me, a disciple is a disciple maker. I just want to be I just want to be used by Jesus so that more people can know Jesus.
That's great. I love those two. As you wrap up our conversation, this has been a phenomenal conversation. what do you want the audience to take away about discipleship or mission pathway?
You can do it. You can disciple someone. You only have to be one step ahead of somebody to disciple them.
Yeah.
And discipleship happens at the speed of relationship.
Mm-hmm. I would say just do something. Like, it doesn't have to be mission pathway. It can be joining Jesus. I love Greg Finke and his stuff. It can be a D2MC. It can be everyone his witness. Like, it can be just learning how to read the Bible. I really don't care what process or path you use to share the faith. Just train your people to do something and step out and try something, and just don't be afraid to fail. I think our fear of failure gets in the way of us doing anything. And I would rather just see people step out and try in any pathway.
Right.
To share the gospel.
Sometimes the best stuff comes out of the failure. Honestly.
Yeah.
I failed a lot, so I know that. Where can people find you guys on social media and connect with you and find Mission Pathway?
If you go to thekairosnetwork.com, and if you go to the Kairos Network on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, we actually made sure to put every missionary pathway video that we created also on YouTube, so that it would be really easy for people to share if they saw a principle they wanted to share. So those are some of the easiest places to find us. And then we have contact forms on there if you want to reach out to us and connect. And you can also go to missionarypathway.org and get directly to the Missionary Pathway training platform itself.
Well, thank you guys so much for this conversation, and blessings on what you're doing. I know it's making an impact here in Iowa. I know I'm seeing pastors excited about the mission of God and sharing it with their members, and I see their members getting excited. So it's just phenomenal to see how we are able to take our Lutheran theology and practice and doctrine into the world and bless the world with it. So thank you for what you do.
Oh, Keith, thanks for having us and letting us share the story, man.
Yeah, no, anytime you should come back and do this again. This was fun.
I would love that.
Yeah, anytime.